When we think of history, we often imagine dusty textbooks, long lists of kings and queens, dates and battles. But beneath the surface of the familiar stories lies a world of truth more shocking, more gripping, and more human than anything most listeners have ever heard. Africa, a continent of immense diversity and ancient civilizations, holds secrets that have been written out of mainstream memory, buried by power, or simply ignored because they are too raw, too disturbing, too real. This isn't the Africa of safari postcards or feel-good documentaries. This is the Africa whose past reveals the darkest corners of humanity, and whose echoes still shape the present in profound ways that people outside the continent rarely understand. From the moment the First Kingdom rose on the banks of the Nile to the violent fractures of the modern era, Africa's story has been marked by brilliance and brutality in equal measure. Great empires that rivaled Rome, hidden societies whose rituals were misunderstood and misrepresented, human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. All of these are parts of a history that has been carefully softened or omitted in the history books most of the world learned from. And today we begin an unfiltered journey into those shadows, into the moments that powerful interests didn't want you to know about, into the painful truths that still haunt millions. The story starts with the empires that dazzled yet terrified. Long before Europe reached its age of conquest, Africa was home to civilizations that dominated vast territories, commanded wealth beyond measure, and shaped cultures far beyond their borders. The kingdom of Kush, nestled beside the Nile, built pyramids that rivaled those of Egypt and at times even ruled over Egypt itself. But beyond the marvels lay the harsher realities of power wars between rival factions, that left entire cities in ruins and secret pacts that enslaved neighboring populations. These weren't simple romantic kingdoms. They were political machines as ruthless and complex as any empire in history. And then there were the lesser-spoken societies whose names rarely appear in global history. Among the forests and savannas, there were kingdoms with codes of justice and law that outsiders feared because they were different, misunderstood, or because they confronted the status quo of neighboring powers. Some of these societies practiced initiation rites that were mischaracterized as savage by later colonizers, not because they were cruel, but because they challenged the Western gaze and the assumptions that came with it. The truth is always more complicated. What looks terrifying to the outsider is not always terror to the insider, and where fear fueled stereotype, truth was buried. But as remarkable as these civilizations were, the first truly devastating chapter in Africa's darker history came with the arrival of external forces seeking wealth, power, and domination. Long before the formal era of European colonization, merchants from distant lands prowled the coasts and rivers, trading gold, ivory, and human lives. The trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades were vast networks that dismantled families, depopulated regions, and left scars that persist across generations. These trades were not accidental. They were systematic, driven by demand in distant markets, and enabled by local politics that were manipulated through coercion, bribes, and alliances of convenience. Then came the era Europeans call the scramble. For Africa, a euphemism so sanitized it obscures the bloodshed beneath it. In the late 19th century, European powers carved up an entire continent like property, drawing borders with straight lines that ignored ethnic groups, languages, and ancient territories. Entire peoples were forced into unnatural unions or separated from their kin, sowing seeds of conflict that still erupt today. Systems of forced labor replaced traditional modes of work. Local rulers who resisted were branded as obstacles to civilization. Those who complied were co-opted into structures that enriched colonizers while impoverishing their own people. The impact was catastrophic, devastating economies and crushing independent culture. What many history books omit are the brutal methods used to enforce colonial rule. In some regions, entire villages were razed to quell resistance. Men, women, and children were taken from their homes and marched to distant ports, never to be seen again. Beatings, torture, and executions became tools of control, justified under the guise of bringing order. There were places where local languages were banned, traditional practices outlawed, and entire belief systems suppressed. The legacy of these policies didn't end with independence. They left psychological wounds and fractured identities that still affect the sense of self and community across the continent. But even after the end of formal colonial rule, Africa's darker chapters didn't vanish. Instead, they took new form: civil wars fueled by external powers, resource conflicts over oil and minerals that turned once peaceful lands into battlegrounds, and political coups that toppled governments with promises of stability while delivering insecurity. There were leaders who once fought for freedom but became tyrants, turning liberation movements into personal empires. In the quest for power, families were destroyed, regions destabilized, and populations displaced. And yet, for all the pain and secrecy, there are stories of extraordinary courage that rise from the darkness. There were communities that resisted domination with incredible resilience. Hidden networks of scholars preserved ancient knowledge even under threat of destruction. Ordinary people found ways to maintain culture, language, and identity in the face of forces that sought to erase them. Africa's history is not just a catalog of horror. It is a testament to survival, resistance, and regeneration. The darker secrets are not meant to make us despair, they are meant to make us understand the full human experience, to honor those who endured, and to learn from truths that were buried or ignored. As we continue this journey in the next part of this exploration, we will uncover specific events, hidden figures, and the untold consequences of policies that shaped the continent in ways still unfolding today. Stay with this story because the truth about Africa's past is more gripping, more complex, and more powerful than anything you've been taught. The shadows of Africa's past grow deeper as we move beyond colonization and into the struggles of post-independence. The story of a continent does not end with the departure of foreign powers. Often, it is then that the true dangers, secrets, and complexities come to light. Independence promised freedom, sovereignty, and the ability to shape a nation, but what awaited many African countries was far from the utopia envisioned. The legacies of borders drawn by foreign rulers, ethnic divisions sown intentionally or by accident, and weakened institutions created a perfect storm for conflict and exploitation. These forces, invisible to the casual observer, have shaped modern Africa in ways the history books rarely discuss. Take, for instance, the civil wars that erupted across the continent. In countries like Nigeria, Congo, and Sudan, internal strife became the norm rather than the exception. Communities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly pitted against one another through political manipulation, competition for resources, or lingering colonial divides. Entire regions were destabilized, forcing millions to flee their homes. Families were torn apart, and cultures that had thrived for generations were placed in jeopardy. While the world watched from a distance, these events were often portrayed in oversimplified narratives, ignoring the intricate local dynamics and the human suffering that unfolded. Daily. One of the most striking yet overlooked aspects of this era is how international powers continued to influence African affairs under the guise of assistance, peacekeeping, or investment. Arms and aid flowed into regions with hidden agendas. Some governments, both local and foreign, exploited tensions to secure economic or strategic advantages, prolonging conflicts and deepening divisions. In many cases, leaders who had once fought for liberation became complicit in these schemes, trading the very freedom they had won for personal gain, wealth, or international approval. These are not just political stories, they are human tragedies, stories of betrayal, courage, and survival. Amid these conflicts, the exploitation of Africa's natural resources became a story in itself. Diamonds, gold, oil, and rare minerals fueled wars, empowered warlords, and enriched foreign corporations while leaving local populations in poverty. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, mineral-rich regions became battlegrounds, where armed groups fought for control of mines, often using child soldiers and employing extreme violence. Communities were displaced, economies collapsed, and the world largely ignored these horrors, focusing instead on headlines that simplified these conflicts into tribal wars, rather than exposing the deeper economic and political machinery driving them. Beyond wars and resource exploitation, Africa's darker history includes numerous instances of political suppression and assassinations. Leaders who dared to challenge entrenched interests were eliminated quietly, with evidence erased and truth buried. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who tried to document these abuses often faced extreme danger. The stories of these individuals, many of whom paid the ultimate price to reveal hidden truths, are seldom shared outside academic circles or investigative reports. Yet they are essential to understanding how power was wielded, often invisibly, to maintain control and silence dissent. Even in regions that seemed stable, secretive networks of influence continued to operate, controlling economies, media, and education. Some societies were influenced by covert organizations whose goals were never fully disclosed, while others experienced interference from powerful global actors pursuing strategic interests. These forces shaped the political landscape subtly, but profoundly, creating an environment where corruption, manipulation, and secrecy flourished. Ordinary citizens bore the consequences, often without understanding the root causes of their hardships or the complex history that led to them. The cultural dimension of Africa's hidden history is equally compelling. Ancient rituals, forbidden knowledge, and suppressed traditions tell a story of a continent whose depth is often misunderstood. Colonial and post-colonial powers systematically dismissed or outlawed indigenous knowledge systems, labeling them as primitive or dangerous. Yet these traditions held knowledge of medicine, governance, agriculture, and conflict resolution that had supported communities for centuries. In suppressing this wisdom, powerful actors ensured that only certain narratives would dominate public perception, leaving the richness of Africa's intellectual and cultural history hidden from view. Africa's darkest secrets are not confined to one period, region, or event. They are woven into the very fabric of the continent's history. From the violent legacies of colonialism to the hidden manipulations of modern power structures, from resource-driven conflicts to the silencing of brave individuals, the truth is complex, multifaceted, and often uncomfortable. But understanding this truth is crucial. It allows us to see Africa not just as a place of struggle or poverty, but as a continent with resilience, ingenuity, and a story that is far richer and more complicated than mainstream narratives suggest. As we explore these stories, it becomes clear that Africa's history is not simply about what is taught or recorded, it is about what has been hidden, altered, or forgotten. The gaps in knowledge are not accidental. They are intentional omissions created to shape perception, maintain control, and obscure accountability. By uncovering these hidden chapters, we gain insight into the forces that have influenced modern Africa, the enduring legacies of past injustices, and the incredible resilience of the people who have survived them. And yet, despite these dangers, Africa's story is also one of hope, courage, and determination. Communities have risen from the ashes of conflict, cultural knowledge has survived attempts at erasure, and ordinary people continue to challenge the status quo. In every shadowed corner of this history, there are acts of bravery, intelligence, and creativity that deserve recognition. These are the threads that bind the continent together, revealing a history that is as complex as it is powerful, as tragic as it is inspiring. As we continue into the next part of this journey, prepare to dive even deeper. We will uncover individual stories of resistance and survival, examine the key figures who shaped these hidden histories, and reveal the events that are so shocking, so powerful, and so rarely discussed that they have remained out of the global consciousness for decades. Stay with this exploration, because the darkest secrets of Africa's past are not only fascinating, they are essential to understanding the present and shaping the future. As we delve further into Africa's shadowed past, it becomes impossible to separate the continent's beauty from its tragedies. Every river, mountain, and city carries a story of both achievement and suffering. From the Great Lakes to the deserts of the Sahara, history has left indelible marks, some hidden, some deliberately obscured, but all contributing to a complex tapestry that reveals the continent's deepest secrets. One of the most startling aspects of Africa's hidden history is the sheer scale of human resilience in the face of repeated crises. Generations of people endured wars, famines, political oppression, and exploitation, yet they continued to innovate, adapt, and preserve their cultures. Understanding these dark chapters requires acknowledging not just the atrocities, but the human strength that persisted despite them. Consider the covert manipulations that occurred in post-colonial Africa, where external powers continued to wield influence even after the formal departure of colonial rulers. Proxy wars became common as rival factions were armed, funded, and directed to secure geopolitical goals. Resources such as oil, diamonds, and strategic minerals were often the silent catalysts behind these conflicts. Entire populations were forced to the margins, living under constant threat, yet their stories were rarely told beyond the boundaries of their nations. These untold histories reveal a pattern of exploitation that is subtle yet devastating, showing how Africa's potential was repeatedly undermined by both external and internal forces. Equally alarming is the way some leaders, once hailed as liberators, transformed into tyrants. Countries that fought for independence often found themselves trapped in cycles of corruption, nepotism, and repression. The heroes of yesterday became the oppressors of today, consolidating power while silencing dissent. Journalists, political opponents, and ordinary citizens who attempted to expose the truth were frequently threatened or eliminated. In many cases, the public never learned the full extent of the injustices that occurred, as information was suppressed or manipulated. Yet the consequences of these actions resonate to this day, influencing political structures, social tensions, and economic disparities across the continent. Another layer of Africa's dark past is the deliberate erasure of cultural memory. Traditional knowledge, rituals, and governance systems that had existed for centuries were systematically undermined, often under the pretense of modernization or progress. Languages, oral histories, and sacred practices were dismissed, outlawed, or ridiculed, leaving generations disconnected from their heritage. This cultural erasure was not accidental. It was a strategy used by colonial and post-colonial authorities to consolidate control and rewrite narratives in ways that favored the powerful. The loss of these cultural touchstones is one of the continent's most profound secrets, a hidden wound that continues to influence identity, social cohesion, and collective memory. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Africa's hidden history lies in its violent economies. From the transatlantic slave trade to modern-day resource conflicts, wealth has often been built on suffering. Entire regions were depopulated, economies destroyed, and communities forced into labor systems that benefited outsiders while leaving locals impoverished. In contemporary times, illegal mining, poaching, and exploitative labor practices continue. These patterns creating a continuity of hidden suffering that most global audiences rarely witness. The stories of those affected workers, families, and communities remain largely invisible, yet they are critical to understanding the full picture of Africa's past and present. Amid these tragedies, however, remarkable acts of resistance emerge. Across the continent, ordinary people found ways to resist oppression, preserve knowledge, and challenge injustice. Underground networks, secret schools, and covert cultural preservation efforts ensured that traditions survived even when political and social systems sought to erase them. Women, often marginalized in mainstream histories, played pivotal roles in maintaining communities, leading movements, and protecting cultural heritage. These stories, hidden in the shadows of recorded history, highlight the courage and ingenuity that have allowed African societies to endure despite relentless adversity. Africa's hidden history also includes lesser-known conflicts and figures whose actions shaped the continent in profound ways. Rivalries between kingdoms, secret societies, and clandestine alliances influenced politics, trade, and social structures in ways that textbooks rarely detail. These events were not isolated. They were connected through networks of power, influence, and survival strategies that spanned centuries. Understanding these connections reveals patterns of control, resistance, and adaptation that are essential to making sense of modern Africa. The psychological impact of these historical secrets cannot be overstated. Generations experience trauma, displacement, and identity disruption, creating collective memories that influence behavior, relationships, and societal structures today. By studying these hidden histories, we begin to understand the roots of ongoing conflicts, social inequalities, and economic challenges. More importantly, we gain insight into the resilience, creativity, and wisdom that have allowed communities to navigate and survive centuries of upheaval. What is clear is that Africa's darkest secrets are not merely about the past. They are alive in the present. They manifest in ongoing struggles over resources, politics, and identity. They appear in the narratives that are told or omitted in schools, media, and global discourse. They are embedded in the fabric of nations and communities, shaping perceptions and influencing the trajectory of societies. To confront these truths is to recognize both the horrors endured and the extraordinary resilience that persists. As we prepare to move into the next chapter of this story, the questions become even more urgent. Who were the unsung heroes who defied oppression and survived in secret? Which events have been deliberately hidden to protect the powerful or to rewrite history? How have these secrets shaped the modern continent, and what lessons can the world learn from them? The answers are both shocking and inspiring, revealing that Africa's history is far more intricate, compelling, and essential than many realize. Stay with this journey because in the final part we will uncover the most hidden, most dangerous, and most transformative events in Africa's history, stories that few have dared to tell, and that will change the way you see the continent forever. The darkest secrets are coming to light, and they are stories you cannot afford to miss. As we reach the final part of this journey into Africa's hidden past, it is essential to understand that the stories we uncover now are not just tales of conflict and suffering, they are revelations about resilience, courage, and the consequences of power left unchecked. The most secretive chapters of the continent's history often involve events that reshaped societies in ways that are still felt today. We have already explored the empires, the colonial manipulations, the post-independence struggles, and the hidden cultural erasures. Now we uncover the events that are rarely spoken of, but whose impact continues to echo across generations. One of the most shocking truths lies in the systematic exploitation of entire populations. Across regions from West Africa to the Horn, there were communities that suffered repeated invasions, forced migrations, and economic disenfranchisement. These were not random events. They were carefully orchestrated strategies by those in power to control land, resources, and populations. Families were torn apart, identities suppressed, and cultures destabilized, leaving scars that are still visible in modern demographics, social tensions, and political boundaries. These episodes of calculated oppression are some of the darkest secrets of the continent because they are often invisible to outsiders, overshadowed by sanitized historical narratives. Equally disturbing are the hidden wars fought over resources, knowledge, and influence. In the Congo, Angola, and Sierra Leone, the extraction of diamonds, gold, and other valuable minerals fueled conflicts that were rarely covered in international news. Governments, warlords, and multinational corporations often worked behind the scenes, profiting from instability while the affected communities bore the human cost. Villages were destroyed, child labor exploited, and generations left traumatized. This was not just physical violence. It was a theft of potential, education, and cultural continuity. The secrecy surrounding these conflicts ensured that global awareness remained low, leaving much of the world unaware of the depth of suffering. Another hidden layer of Africa's darkest history involves the secret alliances and betrayals among leaders, both foreign and domestic. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, coups, assassinations, and clandestine deals shaped nations without public knowledge. Leaders who had promised liberation sometimes became the architects of oppression, consolidating power through fear and manipulation. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who attempted to expose these truths often faced imprisonment, exile, or death. These stories, largely untold, are critical to understanding the full scope of Africa's political landscape and the extraordinary courage required to challenge entrenched authority. Beyond politics and war, Africa's hidden history encompasses epidemics, famines, and environmental crises that were often exacerbated by human action. Colonial and post-colonial administrations frequently mismanaged resources, ignored warning signs, or diverted aid, resulting in widespread suffering. Famines in Ethiopia, Sudan, and parts of southern Africa, for example, were not merely natural disasters. They were compounded by political neglect, conflict, and exploitation. Millions of lives were lost or irreparably changed. Yet the narratives surrounding these tragedies were often simplified or suppressed to maintain political agendas and control public perception. Even cultural and intellectual histories were targeted. Libraries, schools, and archives were destroyed or censored to erase inconvenient knowledge. Scholars and elders who preserved ancient knowledge, traditional medicine, and oral histories risked persecution. The suppression of these intellectual resources has left gaps in global understanding of Africa's innovations, philosophies, and governance systems. Yet, despite these attempts at erasure, knowledge persisted in hidden forms, in stories told quietly, in secret ceremonies, and in resilient communities that safeguarded their heritage against immense pressure. But within these darkest secrets lie extraordinary stories of human triumph. Individuals and communities resisted, innovated, and survived against overwhelming odds. From underground schools that educated children during periods of suppression to rebel groups that fought for justice while risking everything, Africa's hidden history is also a history of courage. Women, often invisible in mainstream accounts, played vital roles in preserving culture, leading resistance, and ensuring the survival of families and communities. These acts of defiance illuminate the strength, intelligence, and creativity that have allowed societies to endure centuries of systemic oppression. As we reflect on these revelations, it becomes clear that Africa's history cannot be reduced to simple narratives of victimhood or tragedy. It is a story of complexity, resilience, and continuous struggle. The darkest secrets, whether wars, political manipulation, cultural suppression, or exploitation of resources, serve not only as warnings but as testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of the people who endured them. By confronting these truths, we gain insight into the realities that have shaped modern Africa, the challenges it continues to face, and the remarkable resilience that defines its societies. It is also important to recognize that uncovering these hidden histories is not just an academic exercise. It has real implications for the present and future. Understanding the causes and consequences of past injustices can inform better governance, more equitable economic systems, and stronger cultural preservation. It allows individuals, communities, and nations to reclaim lost narratives, honor the struggles of those who came before, and shape a more informed and just future. Africa's darkest secrets are not merely about pain, they are about lessons, survival, and the enduring spirit of a continent that refuses to be forgotten or defined solely by suffering. Finally, as we conclude this journey, it is clear that Africa's history is not monolithic. It is a mosaic of triumphs and tragedies, secrets and revelations. From the ancient empires whose stories were buried beneath layers of conquest, to the post-colonial struggles that expose the fragility of freedom, to the resilience and courage of communities who refuse to be erased, the continent's narrative is vast, complex, and essential. The stories we have explored are shocking, sometimes uncomfortable, but they are necessary. They remind us that history is not just what is written, it is what is lived, hidden, remembered, and reclaimed. As you reflect on these stories, remember that Africa's secrets are not simply relics of the past. They are alive in the culture, politics, and societies of today. They challenge us to look deeper, question assumptions, and seek understanding beyond the surface. They reveal a continent that is at once fragile and indomitable, scarred and brilliant, mysterious and profoundly human. This exploration is just the beginning of seeing Africa not through the lens of simplification, but in its full, complex, and compelling truth. Thank you for staying with us through this journey into Africa's hidden past. Remember, history is more than dates and battles. It is the story of people, their struggles, and their courage. Share these stories, question what you think you know, and never stop seeking the truths that others might prefer remain hidden. Africa's darkest secrets are now in the light, and they are stories that deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from.